This evening, we are indeed fortunate to have Lawrence Rush Atkinson IV as our speaker. He's better known as Rick Atkinson, and he has had a marvelous history of prize-winning books that are insightful about military history in particular. Rick is the son of a U.S. military officer, grew up in military posts around the country, so perhaps it's not unusual that he had turned his attention to military history. He did apparently turn down an appointment at West Point and graduated from East Carolina University in North Carolina, and then went on and got a master's in literature from the University of Chicago. His early newspaper career was in Kansas, and then, of course, he spent roughly 25 years with the Washington Post before embarking on his collection of wonderful military histories. He's also had friendships with generals. So, for example, General Petraeus, about whom he has written, is someone that he was with last week. So if you want to ask questions about current military tactics, he will, I'm sure, be well informed to answer your questions. But most importantly, the book is characterized by his thoroughness in terms of touching on every battle with wonderful maps and with great insights, nuggets of information about the various people that you encounter, whether it be Benedict Arnold or George Washington. One thing that you can quiz your friends about, but is highlighted in this book to further well, I would hazard to guess that probably 95% of us didn't know that the United States in its first year invaded Canada. So we started on an acquisition invasion policy back in 1775, 76. So that's the kind of information that'll be covered. Obviously, we weren't successful in winning our 14th colony. But ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm Philadelphia welcome to Rick Atkinson.
Thank you for that, Morris. Thanks for coming tonight to the Free Library, one of the great institutions here, and thanks for making the rain go away. I always feel a bit like I'm coming home when I come to Philadelphia. My mother grew up in Prospect Park in Delaware County, and my father grew up across the river in Moorestown. If you know where that is. My grandfathers were a banker in Philadelphia and a businessman in Philadelphia. My people were Quakers in Bucks County originally. And the family went to Ocean City on the Jersey Shore for the better part of 100 years. So if that doesn't make you an honorary Philadelphian, I don't know what does. Morris mentioned that my middle name is Rush. Lawrence Rush Atkinson IV. My son is the fifth. It's a terrible thing to inflict on a child. And family lore had it for years that the Rush derived from Benjamin Rush, the great Philadelphia physician, and he's really the father of American medicine, and a successor to Benjamin Franklin, really, as the Renaissance man. And I have to say that was a family lie. It's not true. There's no relation. When I looked a little closer, unfortunately, we're not related. And then the last personal note I'll mention is when I got out of college, I thought I wanted to work for the Philadelphia Inquirer, one of the great newspapers in America. And that didn't happen because I didn't have any skills and didn't have any experience. But I went out to visit my father, who was then stationed at Fort Riley in Kansas as an Army officer, an infantry officer. And I had met the editor of the Topeka, Kansas newspaper the previous summer at my father's house. And my mother, who was very worried because I had no skills, no money, no future, prevailed on me to call this man. His name was Lee Porter, and he very kindly took my call and said, I don't have any jobs here for you in the big city of Topeka, but I do know about an entry-level reporting job in Pittsburgh. And I said, Pittsburgh, that's great. My mom and dad are from Philadelphia. That would be terrific. He said, not that Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, Kansas. which is down in the southeast corner of the state where Kansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma come together. And that's where I went, and that's where I started in the newspaper business long, long ago. So, at any rate, it's good to be back in Philadelphia, even if it's roundabout. So the last time I was here shilling a new book was 6 years ago, in 2013, when we rolled out The Guns at Last Light, which was the third and final volume of what I called the Liberation Trilogy, about the American role in the liberation of Europe during World War II. It was a project that took me 15 years. And even then, in 2013, I was pondering what to do next. The obvious thing would have been to pivot to the Pacific and to do for that campaign what I had done for the Mediterranean and Western Europe. But that would have required me to start World War II all over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier, and that didn't have much appeal. And besides, I couldn't shake a personal fascination with a different century and a different war, and I think a fascination that began when I was in first and second grade in Prospect Park, when my dad was in Korea and we lived with my grandparents. So I've now completed the first volume of what I hope, knock wood, will be another trilogy. The British Are Coming opens with an extended prologue in June 1773, when King George III travels to Portsmouth on the southern coast of England for a 4-day review of the Royal Navy. It's a proud display of military muscle precisely a decade after the creation of the first British Empire, with Britain's victory over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War. The French and Indian War, as we know it. 1773 is the year the phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was coined. And this volume ends with the two battles of Trenton and the subsequent battle at Princeton in January 1777, which resuscitated American hopes that had seemed all but extinguished at that point. Now, it may be a little impolitic to say this in the city where it all began, but let me suggest that there is a lot to dislike about the Founding Fathers and the war they waged for independence. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 black slaves. It was 1 in 5 of all souls in the 13 colonies when those fine words were written right over there in 1776. Nor was it valid for Native Americans, for women, for indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the crown, and even fence straddlers skeptical of armed insurrection, often were subjected to dreadful treatment: public shaming, disenfranchisement, confiscation, beatings, torture, exile, and worse. Some were imprisoned on Hudson River scows anchored just below Albany, or in an old Connecticut copper mine where they were lowered by windlass 70 feet below ground to rock-walled cells known simply as hell. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war. John Adams later admitted that I would have hanged my own brother had he taken part with our enemies in the contest. Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished during the war. In a defensive war waged for liberty and to secure basic rights, the Americans, as Morris noted, promptly invaded Canada in an attempt to win by force of arms what could not be won by blandishment and negotiation, a 14th colony. This was the first, but hardly the last, time the Americans would invade another land on the pretext of bettering life for the invaded. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer leaving his plow in the furrow to take up his musket on behalf of freedom is largely mythical. During the Revolution, General George Washington rarely had more than 20,000 troops, and sometimes his army was as few as 3,000. This in a country of 2.5 million people. Particularly after the initial martial enthusiasms aroused at Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill faded in 1775, relatively few American men volunteered for military service, especially if it involved enlisting for the duration in the badly armed, badly fed, badly clothed, and too often badly led American army. And yet, who would deny that our creation story, the story of our founding, remains valid, vivid, and thrilling? Even in 2019, at a moment when national unity is elusive, when our partisan rancor seems ever more toxic, when the simple concept of truth is assailed, that story informs who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and perhaps the most profound question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. Indeed, at least 25,000 Americans died in the cause, and perhaps many more. It's a larger proportion of our population than died in any conflict other than the Civil War in our national history. So, what can we learn from that ancient quarrel? First, that this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. Second, that there are foundational truths that not only are indeed true, but also, as the Declaration of Independence insists, self-evident. Third, that leaders worthy of our enduring admiration rise to the occasion with acumen, grit, wisdom, grace. And fourth, that whatever trials beset us today, we have overcome greater perils before. We're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation after many subsequent struggles. It includes strictures on how to divide power and to keep it from concentrating in the hands of those who think primarily of themselves. We cannot let that heritage slip away. We cannot permit it to be taken away. We cannot be oblivious to this priceless gift or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it. Very important to remember this, particularly during Memorial Day week. Now, the American Revolution was not a war between regimes or dynasties fought for territory or the usual commercial advantages, but rather an improvised struggle between two peoples of a common heritage who had been gradually sundered by divergent values and conflicting visions of the future. The Americans eventually won by embracing fewer strategic misconceptions than the British did. Now, certainly the rebels, let's say us, could be wrong-headed in believing that they had greater economic leverage over the mother country than they actually did, for example. Or in caricaturing George III, who sat on his throne for 60 years and was shrewder, more complex, and more admirable than the overbearing ninny who still dominates our imaginations and even tonight is mincing across stages in Hamilton. Yet George and his ministers made three critical miscalculations. First, that most colonists remained loyal to the crown, notwithstanding troublemakers in New England capable of inciting a rabble. Second, that firmness, including military firepower, would intimidate the obstreperous and restore harmony. And third, that failure to reassert London's authority in America would eventually unstitch the newly created British Empire, and it would encourage insurrections in Ireland, Canada, the Sugar Islands in the West Indies, India. It's an 18th century version of the domino theory that would propel America into Vietnam almost 2 centuries later. Britain also underestimated the difficulty of waging a protracted war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail, for 8 years, as it turned out. Expeditionary warfare, whether waged in North America in the 18th century or in Central Asia in the 21st century, is among the hardest of all martial enterprises. The British Army in the Revolution, unable to gather food and forage from the American countryside without being ambushed, relied largely on provisions shipped from English and Irish ports. But Of 40 transport vessels dispatched across the Atlantic in the winter of 1775-76, only 8 of those 40 reached the King's forces in occupied Boston directly. The rest were blown back to England or blown to the West Indies or intercepted by rebel marauders. Of 550 Lincolnshire sheep carried on ships that actually did make it to Boston, only 40 of those 550 arrived alive, despite the thought that Lincolnshire sheep were the hardiest and best able to endure the rigors of transatlantic travel. Of 290 hogs shipped, just 74 arrived alive. Of 5,200 barrels of flour that arrived in one shipment, nearly all of them proved rancid. When the British moved to New York in the summer of 1776 and requested 950 horses to pull their artillery carriages and their supply wagons, 412 of the 950 horses sent across the Atlantic died during the voyage. Scores more were ruined beyond use. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Logistics is always hard in war. I've personally seen just how hard in Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Even when the American rebels were fighting on their home turf in the Revolution, they faced enormous difficulties. Of 75 official letters that General Washington wrote in January and February of 1776, more than half mention munition shortages, often in pleading, fretful terms, particularly about gunpowder, which he just called the thing. It's difficult to make musket balls without lead. And by the summer of 1776, the Americans were desperately short of the stuff. In New York, more than 100 tons of lead weights from fishing nets, clocks, window sash cords were collected to make bullets, along with lead from downspouts and window glass cames and pewter dishes. Without salt, armies and navies couldn't stockpile the meat and fish needed to move anywhere. 2 bushels of salt, more than 100 pounds, were needed to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. Beef required even more. Before the war, Americans imported about 15 million bushels of salt, half of it from the West Indies and half from Britain and Southern Europe. But the British trade embargo, once the shooting started, strangled 2/3 of those salt shipments. To encourage salt works along the coast, including nearby, pamphlets were printed with recipes for making salt. John Adams wrote, "All the old women and children are gone down to the Jersey shore to make salt." That must have been quite a sight. But 400 gallons of seawater were needed to boil off 1 bushel of salt, and that took enormous stacks of firewood. Virginia spent more than 6,000 pounds, a huge sum in those days, to build evaporation ponds along the Chesapeake Bay, but they collected a total of 50 bushels. It was probably the most expensive salt in the history of salt. Yet those problems, substantial as they were, hardly matched Britain's problems. The 1,000 tons of bread needed to feed British soldiers each month in New York often arrived from depots in Cork, moldy and infested with Irish rats. And there's no rat as nasty as an Irish rat. And those rats soon infested British storehouses on Staten Island. For the winter of 1776-77, the British needed 64,000 cords of firewood, 70 tons of candles. The daily allowance of a gill of rum for each redcoat, a gill was 5 ounces. It's about a gallon a month. You can see why they had inebriation problems in the British Army. But that daily allowance took an enormous amount of shipping space. The British Navy Board needed 400 transports and victualling ships to move and supply the large force in New York. It was triple the tonnage that had been used during the 7 Years' War, which was a global war. Well, let me talk for a moment about George, our last king. He's an intriguing adversary. Queen Elizabeth II only recently opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owns, as part of a project to catalog and digitize the papers from all four Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 350,000 pages, mostly from the reign of King George III, and most of them previously unpublished. I was among the first allowed in to take a look for a whole month in April 2016, which happened to be the month the Queen turned 90 at Windsor. And the papers are stored at Windsor Castle. I hope we're on high ground here. So every morning, I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate, and then show it again at the Norman gate, and then I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers, in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind, and he wrote not only most of his correspondence himself, but he also made the copies. And as you paw through these pages, they don't make you wear gloves, there's a tactile sense of being in his presence. Among other things, he's a great list maker. Lists of British garrisons abroad from 1764 to 1775, of Royal Navy vessels under construction in various shipyards, of all his regiments in America, with the number of officers, musicians, and rank and file, for each tabulated with his arithmetic scratchings in the margin as he does his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup. Write this down. Rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver. And insecticide, wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, quicksilver. He was an ardent theater goer, and he kept critical notes on dramatic actors he'd seen, including one actor he described as had a formal gravity in his mien and a piercing eye. Well, he'd married an obscure, drab German princess, Charlotte, as in Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlottesville, who learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord during her voyage from Germany to England. They married 6 hours after they met, and he had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish, because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity, eventually to number 15, and we see in his personal correspondence that George is a caring father, invested in the rearing of his kids. And through all this, he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. He's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to detest or to dismiss simply as a reactionary autocrat. The war he chooses to wage is brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing is usually intimate, at very close range, face-to-face, often with a bayonet in the 18th century. And that's partly because 18th century muskets were mostly inaccurate beyond 50 yards. If I fired it at the wall back here, I might hit the wall. And beyond 100 yards, pretty hopeless. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, and in the British retreat to Boston on the first day of the Revolution, April 19th, 1775, the Americans fired at least 75,000 rounds, but only one bullet in every 300 or so actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard round the world probably missed. Battlefield wisdom held that it took a man's weight in bullets to kill him, and in the Revolutionary War, that was not far wrong. On the other hand, massed musket fire, clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1-ounce lead slugs flying downrange at perhaps 1,000 feet a second, That could be devastating. A man 5 feet 8 inches tall, a little shorter than I am, had an exterior surface of 2,550 square inches, of which 1,000 square inches were exposed to gunfire if he was facing an enemy frontally at close range. Given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, hardly worthy of the name, if you're hit in the torso, you have more than a 50% chance of dying. If you're hit in the head, your chances of survival are even worse. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those in muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, especially those few, relatively few with rifles, which were more accurate than muskets but were harder to load, slower to load, and couldn't accept a bayonet, learned to target the brightest of the red coats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes that made those coats pop. It's like wearing a coat that said, "Shoot me" on the back. In the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775, the British captured roughly a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. Well, those are some of the nuts and bolts of 18th century warfare, but what of the emotional guts of the Revolution? That's what still moves us, stirs our pride, makes us feel that those men and women of a dozen generations or more ago have something to say to us. Why is that? Well, certainly that revolutionary generation can seem so distant from us as to be almost a foreign people. If irony and skepticism are the twin lenses of modern consciousness, the revolutionaries often seem archaic. They're far less ironic and skeptical in their worldview than their 21st century descendants. They speak English, of course, but they have their own argot idiom, their own slang. For example, passing counterfeit money, widely practiced in the 18th century, was known as shoving the queer. Someone who died took heaven by the way. British soldiers in Boston, by the way, sometimes referred to Americans derisively as Jonathans. But these are minor differences. We rightly admire those Americans for their endurance, pertinacity, and sacrifice, not only displayed by men serving in the ranks, but others caught up in the fraught events of those times. Lois Peters of Connecticut hadn't seen her husband, Captain Nathan Peters, in months because he was part of the army besieging Boston, when she wrote to him, "Pray come home as soon as possible. A visit from you at any time would be agreeable." Meanwhile, she would harvest the corn, sell their oxen for enough cash to keep the family saddlery solvent, sew him a shirt, and take great pleasure doing it, she told him, and keep faith with the future. She signed her letters, "Your loving wife until dead." General Nathanael Greene makes one of the worst operational decisions of the war by leaving 3,000 American troops exposed and vulnerable at Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, where in the space of 8 hours on November 16, 1776, they're trapped and killed or captured. This is during a period when American generalship is often characterized by miscalculation, misfortune, imprudence, and deficient military skills. But Greene picks himself up, takes a deep breath, and writes to Cotty, his wife, "The virtue of the Americans is put to a trial. I am hearty and well amidst all the fatigues and hardships. Be of good courage. Don't be distressed. All things will turn out for the best." Be of good courage. He's speaking to us, to you and to you. He's certainly speaking to me. The sheer drama of the revolution keeps it compelling and often thrilling, from the bloodletting at Bunker Hill, where 1 of every 8 British officers killed during the Long War would die in 4 hours, to the skin of the teeth escape by Washington and his army in the fog across the East River after a terrible drubbing on Long Island in August 1776. And beyond the battlefield, the theatrical power and pathos of the conflict outruns any dramatist's imagination. The abrupt arrival of the septuagenarian Benjamin Franklin, local boy, in Paris to woo the French absolute monarchy into an alliance with radical Republicans. The 100,000 smallpox deaths in North America from 1775 to 1782. Those white men sitting right over here in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, lashing at horseflies with their handkerchiefs while carving up Thomas Jefferson's draft declaration to make it shorter and much better. The many American families, Ben Franklin's among them, ripped apart by irreconcilable political differences. If the central figures in our creation story have been often embalmed in reverence, they nonetheless remain beguiling, worthy of perpetual scrutiny and often of emulation. Washington is a case in point. Yes, he owned more than 300 slaves when he died at Mount Vernon in 1799. You cannot square that moral circle. He demonstrated shortcomings as a tactical commander at Long Island, Fort Washington, and on other battlefields. The man who proverbially could never tell a lie sure could prevaricate. And Washington's carping about his troops, his officers, and his lot in life, "I distrust everything," he grumbled in 1776, transforms the demigod into a sometimes petulant mortal. Yet great responsibility enlarges him. We can't ask more of our leaders. He rightly embodies the sacrifice of personal interest to a greater good, as well as other Republican virtues, small r, probity, dignity, moral stamina, incorruptibility, traits that should remain true north for every citizen today. Affliction is the good man's shining time, Abigail Adams said of him. Lesser personalities, largely lost to history, speak to Americans in the 21st century of constancy and an antique patriotism. "Heaven only knows what may be my fate," Captain John McPherson wrote in a last letter to his father before being killed at Quebec. "I experience no reluctance in this cause to venture a life which I consider is only lent to be used when my country demands it." Likewise, Lieutenant Samuel Cooper wrote to his wife, "The dangers we are to encounter I know not, but it shall never be said to my children, 'Your father was a coward.'" He too died at Quebec. Even Benedict Arnold, perhaps the finest battle captain on either side in the early couple years of the war before his subsequent perfidy, wrote after being shot in the leg in Canada, "I am in the way of duty and I know no fear." Some years ago, the distinguished historian John Shaw, who taught at the University of Michigan for years, wrote that the Civil War, like every other major event in American history, including the Second World War, has a tragic, human, two-sided quality that the Revolution seems to lack. The whole complex of revolutionary events takes on a smooth, self-contained character that makes getting the right emotional grip on the subject very difficult. My premise is that tragedy is the bedrock of every war because every war is about young men, and now young women, dying young. My ambition has been to find the emotional grip, as Professor Shaw put it, to revive the tragic human multi-sided quality that saturates the American saga from 1775 to 1783. So we see Lieutenant Edward Hull. He's a young Scottish officer in the 43rd Regiment of Foot, shot at North Bridge in Concord, then shot again during the British retreat to Boston, captured by the Americans, in agony from 3 bullet wounds, sucking on an orange donated by a compassionate rebel. He lingers for nearly 2 weeks in a twilight of pain and remorse before he too takes heaven by the way. Or we see Mary Pierce, the widow of a private killed at Bunker Hill while fighting with the Massachusetts militia, as she petitions the Commonwealth for precisely £5 and 12 shillings in compensation for her husband's lost coat, trousers, stockings, shoes, buckles, silk handkerchief, knife, and tobacco box. Or General Richard Montgomery, like Montgomery County, in the assault on Quebec, hit by grape shot through both thighs and mortally through the face. After his death, 2 days later, his effects were auctioned off item by item to his officers. 2 volumes of Polybius, Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, a buffalo skin and clothes brush bought by Captain Aaron Burr, and a wardrobe that included ruffled shirts, holland waistcoats, and a pair of tea tongs, all bought by Benedict Arnold. Or we see Île aux Noix, the island of nuts. It's a couple hundred acres in the Richelieu River just above the New York border, where thousands of American soldiers retreating from Canada in June 1776 jammed a malarial hell. Half of them suffering from smallpox, dysentery, typhus, or other god-awful maladies, infested with lice and maggots. One doctor wrote, "We had nothing to give them. It broke my heart, and I wept until I had no more power to weep." And we see Matthew Patton of Bedford, New Hampshire, whose son John had survived a gunshot wound to the arm at Bunker Hill, but did not survive Île aux Noix. Mr. Patton wrote simply in his diary, "I got an account of my John's death of the smallpox at Canada. He was 24 years and 31 days old." The historian Bruce Caton considered the American Civil War a redemptive tragedy, and surely the same can be said of the American Revolution. It embodied the enduring aspirations of an idealistic people, and it brought forth a nation abounding with a sense of destiny. No wonder the world was agog. "The cause of America," wrote the essayist Thomas Paine, also right here, "is the cause of all mankind." Even now, the war for independence offers clues to our national character, to our temperament. It remains a bright mirror in which we see traits that fashion the American character, from ingenuity and resilience to brutality and pugnacity. We've come far in almost 2.5 centuries in power, diversity, tolerance, and sheer scale. But in some respects, those ancestors remain nearer than we know. Their existential struggle churned up issues that perplex us to this day, including individual liberty versus collective security, the proper limits on executive power, the obligations of citizenship, and the elusive quest for a more equitable society. The tacit primal question of 1776 persists in 2019. Who do we want to be? Democracy is never a thing done, the poet and Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish told us. Democracy is always something that a nation must be doing. Even Jefferson's Declaration, our foundational secular scripture, we hold these truths to be self-evident, is dynamic, never a thing done, something a nation always must be doing. The great Yale historian Edmund Morgan wrote that the creed of equality did not give men and women equality, but invited them to claim it, invited them not to know their place and keep it, but to seek and demand a better place. The American Revolution lasted 3,089 days, and the result was epical and enduring. The creation of the American Republic, one of mankind's greatest achievements. Nearly 90,000 more days have elapsed since those horsefly-swatting men asserted a human birthright of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Keeping faith with those who fought, suffered, and died for the principles we profess to still cherish requires more than a nodding acquaintance with them, more than a perfunctory acknowledgement of their struggles. For better and for worse, their story is our story. Their fight remains our fight. Thanks again for having me here tonight. Thank you very much.
Is there any truth to Paul Revere's ride?
Is there any truth to Paul Revere's ride? Excuse me while I think about that. Yeah, it's all true. It's all true except he did not yell, "The British are coming." That would have made no sense to people living in Middlesex at the time because they were British. They considered themselves British. What he probably yelled repeatedly, and he's quoted, still on high ground, I hope, is "the regulars are coming out." The regulars meaning the British Army coming out of Boston. I use that title, "The British are coming," because that's really what this volume is about. The British are coming and coming and coming. And they are coming not only with the British Army and a very substantial portion of the greatest fleet the world has ever seen. They're bringing 30,000 German mercenaries, and they're coming to kill you and rape your women and destroy your houses. And that's what they're doing. It is really brutal. And, the British are coming. The concept strikes fear in people, as you might imagine. So Revere's ride, the general version of it, and it's true. Revere was a talented silversmith and a radical in Boston, and he had been used to carry messages of importance from Boston even before April 19, 1775. He was a fine horseman, and he was willing to sit in the saddle for hours and days to carry messages. And so on the night when the British were sent to Concord, they sent about 900 men in the first contingent to seize munitions, cannons, and other war material that British intelligence had correctly identified as being in Concord. Concord's about 18 miles from Boston. Revere was given the task to warn the folks in Lexington, including senior members of the radical intelligence like John Hancock, for example, and to warn everybody. So off he went. The notion that he was rowed across Boston Harbor, and there was a big, fast horse waiting for him there. And off he rode through the countryside, alerting people. He got to Lexington. He warned the main people that he was warning that they were coming, and then he got himself captured. Revere being Revere, and he was full of chutzpah. And he basically managed to talk his way out of British custody. They took his horse, they took his saddlebags, but they let him go. By this time, the countryside was aroused, and there were lots of Paul Reveres riding all over the place. It was a very busy night. The traffic on the back roads to the west of Boston was unbelievable. Every time you turned around, somebody was yelling that there was trouble coming down the road. So, he's an admirable man, and he was subsequently used to carry other messages as the siege of Boston continued. He's a really impressive figure. His life is tinted with tragedy. He had, I think, by 2 wives, I think it was 15 or 16 kids. He was matching George III, baby for baby. And most of them died before their time. He talked about them as his little lambs. And so he really has a deep vein of tragedy running through his life.
The Howe brothers, unique, seemed to me to be a little more competent than the stupidity of the governors, who you do an excellent job of describing, Dunmore, et cetera. But what's your opinion on their role at this limited time period?
Yeah. In referring to the Howe brothers, H-O-W-E, my mother, who grew up in Prospect Park, was a Howe, H-O-W-E. We don't talk about that part of the family background. General William Howe was the British commander once the war began in earnest in Boston. He replaced General Gage, and his older brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, was the British naval commander here. There was an older brother still who had been killed in the French and Indian War. He was considered by some to be the greatest soldier in the British Army, and he was killed at Ticonderoga. And the Howe brothers always had a soft spot for Americans, particularly New Englanders, because the death of the eldest of the Howe brothers really moved people in New England. He was seen as a martyr, and they built, in Westminster Abbey, the citizens of Massachusetts paid for an elaborate memorial to him. The Howe brothers didn't forget that. Now they show up here with instructions to crush the insurrection. And they also show up here in the summer of 1776 when Admiral Howe arrives with instructions to see if there's any wiggle room for negotiation. And so they meet on Staten Island with a delegation sent by Congress, and it includes the ubiquitous Benjamin Franklin, who, for a guy who's in his 70s, is everywhere, and John Adams, and a third guy, Rutledge. It's very civil. Admiral Howe has very narrow instructions from London about the extent to which he's permitted to negotiate. And it's evident right away that there is no room for negotiation, in part because the Declaration of Independence has just been promulgated. And that's a Rubicon, and the Americans are not going to come back over that river. And so the talks go nowhere. There's a few pleasantries exchanged, and they go about the war. The Howe brothers in general have not been treated kindly by history, particularly by British historians, and especially General Howe, who is seen at times as being excessively timid, slow-moving. And there are a number of occasions when he seems right on the cusp of exterminating the American army, perhaps even capturing or killing Washington, and it doesn't happen. I mentioned the East River, where Washington gets away, for example. The retreat across New Jersey in the late fall of 1776, where Washington, with only 3,000 men in his army, crosses the Delaware into Pennsylvania and regroups and then attacks in a surprise attack, desperate attack at Trenton. So, you know, Howe has been criticized, General Howe, for failing to be aggressive enough to end the war early. And the British want to end the war early. They know that the French are waiting to stick it to them. The French, since the end of the 7 Years' War, they have wanted nothing more than to hurt the British as badly as they can. And they come to the conclusion, encouraged by Benjamin Franklin, that the best way to do it is to support the American rebels, which, of course, they do secretly at first, and then in 1778, they come in full force on our side. The last thing I'll say about General Howe, he has good reasons for not being excessively aggressive. First of all, he has marched up Breed's Hill in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and every member of his staff, every one of those young officers is killed or wounded around him. When he comes back down off that hill, he's covered in blood. He doesn't have a scratch, but it's the blood of his men. That sticks with him. It'd stick with anybody. So he knows that, first of all, these ragtag rebels are not to be underestimated, that they're pretty good with firelocks. Second, he also knows that manpower is a very precious commodity when you're fighting across 3,000 miles of open ocean. The British Army is not that big compared to, say, the French Army, which is considerably bigger. And every man he loses is a man who is difficult to replace. It's one of the reasons why they hire 30,000 Germans, because there are not enough people volunteering to go into the British Army, to go 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean to kill their cousins. And so he's got to be careful when it comes to casualties. And it is a supportable strategic decision that he's making at the time. So there are nuances about the Howes that I think, again, lead you to have some sympathy with them.
One of the joys of reading your books is the wealth of detail, particularly about smaller people, not just George III, but the officer who died, who was given the orange. And I wonder how you find these stories and how you decide which of these stories to tell and which not to tell.
Yeah, that's a hard question because it's broad, but it's a good question. It's the narrative art. It's it's what storytellers do. You're deciding what to leave in and what to leave out. As far as finding the stories, I'm an indefatigable researcher. I'm an archive rat. The mystery of the next unopened archival box continues to beguile me, even though it's a very solitary and often very tedious task. And it's in those archives where you find the stories that help to bring to life the tale, and not just the broad strokes and the big guys at the top wearing a lot of braid, but of the individual stories that have often been lost to history. It's hard with the 18th century, I have to say, having spent 15 years looking at World War II, partly because women, people of color, Native Americans, poor people, they don't leave a footprint for the most part. I wish I had a dozen Abigail Adams. This would be a lot easier because she's the smartest of all of them. She's a terrific writer. She's very opinionated. And she has this wonderful relationship with John, her husband. But she's the exception that proves the rule. And when you look at the other categories I mentioned, it's very hard to find anything about those 500,000 black slaves. So teasing that out of the historical record is difficult. And then, when I find them, when you find them, you know them. And then to include them in the tale, I'm looking, first of all, for people who will be with me through 3 volumes, as was the case with the World War II trilogy. Looking for people who can help carry the story, in part so that we can watch them grow or not. We can watch them to help, they can carry the story because they are the story. So I'm interested in them. And some obviously are inescapable. You cannot write about the American Revolution without George Washington. Why would you want to? Benedict Arnold is just an absolutely fascinating character. A man born to lead other men in the dark of night. That's a rare quality. And yet, we will see, he has a dark part of his soul. And I'm seeing that. I'm seeing issues even in 75, 76, where we're seeing sort of foreshadowing of that Arnold, the man who becomes synonymous with treason. So, and I throw a lot out. I'm sorry, there's no room for you in this story. The book is big enough already. And it's painful because, you spend a lot of time trying to find them and identify them, and you grow to like them or be intrigued by them, but you have to make hard choices.
I'm interested to learn, if you put yourself in the place of King George III, what you would have done to prevent the revolution and keep the colonies under control, and then if we leap forward into the future, how you would have, after war has broken out, what changes you would have made to win the war.
I'd like to be a monarch. I think it would suit me. I'd be a benign king. What could he have done differently? What would he have wanted to do differently if he could look back on it at the end of his life? Of course, he was crazy at the end of his life, but before that point, well, one of the issues is that George, like all of his ministers, really knows very little about us, the Americans. George never leaves England. He never even goes to Scotland, much less to America. And his ministers are, not much better traveled. And so they have a lot of misconceptions about the Americans. The Americans largely have been left alone for 150 years. And they have developed their own self-governing mechanisms, local councils and assemblies. And this has been benign neglect by the British. And it's after the 7 Years' War when they're strapped for cash, they're really teetering on bankruptcy, and they decide that they need the Americans to help underwrite this war from which they claim we have profited, and they begin to impose taxes without our consent, famously. And they also leave some regiments here. And those regiments initially are on the frontier, protecting people in western Pennsylvania from Indian marauders and trying to keep the peace, actually, on the frontier. But then they end up in Boston. And that's a recipe for trouble, and the Boston Massacre in 1770, and that inflames everybody. So George is watching this from afar, getting fragmentary reports, getting fragmentary and often erroneous reports from the colonial governors, and drawing wrong conclusions. I mentioned some of the strategic wrong decisions he's making. If he had had the wits and the wherewithal, and it's asking too much, really, to have envisioned something like the Commonwealth, which will come into effect the next century, the 19th century, where colonies are permitted to have their own self-governance, and are really independent nations, of course, but they have a loose affiliation with the mother country in the Commonwealth, so Canada, Australia, and so on. It's possible that before the shooting starts, if somebody had come up with that idea and had basically permitted the Americans to govern themselves while professing some allegiance to Parliament and to the king, that might have tempered feelings. But, as war generally tends to spiral out of control. Events spiral out of control. We've seen it in our time, certainly. It never goes the way you think it's going to go. Never. I've spent an entire professional life studying war, old wars and new wars, and it never goes as you think it's going to go. And so his presumptions, first of all, are wrong about the people he's trying to force back into obedience, and they're wrong about how the trajectory of the war. And it's difficult, even in retrospect, even if we can wave a magic wand and say, if you did this and you did that, to see how they could have come to the compromising middle ground that would have staved off what was to come. And I don't think, even though I've spoken highly of him, because I do admire him in some ways, he's not the guy for it. For one thing, the last thing I'll say about him, when the war starts, he's driving the train. Now, it's a constitutional monarchy, and under the strictures handed down in 1688, he is required to pay close attention to both houses of Parliament and to his ministers, and it's a constitutional monarchy. But he is a war hawk. So his prime minister through most of the war, Lord North, who's a childhood friend of his, brilliant politician, handles the House of Commons just magnificently. He doesn't want to be a war minister. He doesn't have the heart for it. And so George is the one who's constantly bucking him up. And George is identifying hawks like George Germain, who becomes the Minister for America and is kind of the Robert McNamara of the war. And George takes a lot of responsibility for it. And once the blood, he says before Lexington and Concord, blows must decide. He's gotten to that point. And he said, bring it on, bring it on. And at that point, it's really, there's no turning back, you have to say. Thank you again so much.